Okay, so what this particular video aims to do is explore, as an introductory component, what do you already know about ecosystems? So in the last video, we looked about plastic pollution in our oceans and why it is worthwhile to be studying this as a whole. So, what do you already know? Small pieces of plastic can collect in the stomachs of small fish. When these fish are eaten by larger animals, the plastic is passed up the food chain. So before we move on, let's quickly check what you can remember about food chains from stage 4, so year 7 and year 8. Here in question 1, you have been asked, classify each of the following animals as either a carnivore, omnivore, herbivore, or decomposer. If at any point you get stuck, there is a specific label that says I'm not sure. So, if we first look at this dugong, the description tells us a dugong eats seagrass. So, we know that if it eats seagrass, it is not an animal, it is not meat, so it has the potential to be a herbivore. Herbivore being an organism that does not eat meat. So we're just going to move this here for now because that is a possible candidate. Now, a brittle star breaks down dead organisms and waste products. So for something to break down another organism, what we're looking at there is potentially a decomposer, because we remember that decomposers are organisms that help break down dead matter. So we'll leave that there for now. A green sea turtle eats seagrass and algae. It also eats worms, jellyfish, and shellfish. So not only does it eat plants, but it also eats other animals or sea creatures. So it eats both animals and plants. So out of our options left, we might consider it an omnivore, remembering that an omnivore eats both animals and plants. And the last option here, a seal eats a variety of fish, squid, and shellfish. So all of these three in this seal's diet, all these three organisms, they are all other animals of some sort. As a result, they are classified as meats. As a result, we would say our seal is potentially a carnivore. So, if we go ahead and show the correct answer, what it'll tell us is the dugong is a herbivore, so it only eats plants. Your brittle star is a decomposer because it breaks down dead organisms. Your green sea turtle is an omnivore because it eats both plants and animals. And lastly, your seal is a carnivore because it only eats other animals. So, moving on to question 2. What does it mean for something to decompose? So we talked about that briefly in the question above, but for something to decompose, what we're talking about is it's being broken down into smaller or simpler substances. These substances can then be recycled back into the environment and reused by other organisms. So that is exactly what this brittle star up here is doing. It's decomposing, it's breaking down a dead organism and returning these substances back into the environment for other organisms to come and use. Moving on to question 3. Complete this simple food chain by inserting arrows between the organisms or living things. Then, classify each level of the food chain using the labels provided. So, this very first row here, we have seaweed, a space, small fish, another space, big fish, space, and then an orca. Now, with the blue boxes, it is now our job to put in the arrows, a left or a right arrow. So, Depending on the way the arrows are placed, it tells us the direction of the energy. So, if we use this particular arrow, this left-hand side arrow, what it tells us is whatever is on the organism that is closest to the arrow head is consuming whatever is at the end of this arrow. So, for example, if we go ahead and place this arrow as such, that tells us that this seaweed is consuming this small fish. And from what we know about seaweed, seaweed's just a plant. It's not going to eat a fish. So we know we cannot use this kind of arrow. Whereas if we choose this arrow here, what it then tells us is this seaweed is moving up this arrow and feeding this fish. Another way to think of it is this fish on the arrowhead is eating this seaweed. From there, we need to consider the relationship between the small fish and the big fish. Is it more likely that the small fish will consume the big fish, or will the big fish more likely consume the small fish? Hopefully, you would have considered that the big fish consumes the small fish, and as such, we go ahead and place this arrow here, which tells us this big fish on the receiving side of this arrow collects and consumes the energy from this small fish at the end of this arrow. Now, if we go ahead and consider this relationship between the big fish and the orca, once again, the orca is more likely to consume the big fish, so this arrow is more suitable, whereas the orca consumes this big fish. Now comes the labels underneath them. If we look at these orange boxes, we have a few choices to choose from. Now, we know what we should remember is that a producer is the majority of the time going to be a plant. Out of the 4 options up here, I can only see that there is one plant, the seaweed. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this label right about there. Then we move on to our next options: primary consumer, tertiary consumer, or secondary consumer. The easiest way to consider this is to think about it and relate it to your schooling or your education. You started off with primary school. Then you went to secondary school, also known as high school. And if you later on choose to go to university or TAFE, that is what we call tertiary education. So primary school was K to 6. Secondary school is high school, so 7 to 12. Then tertiary education is any further studies. So keeping in mind that primary school came first, out of the 3 options we have left, our primary consumer came first. So it's the first organism to consume the producer. That's what a primary consumer means here. Moving on, we have an organism that consumes our primary consumer. So we've gone from primary school, we finish primary school, then we move on to secondary school. So then we start high school. So we're going to go ahead and move this box over here. When we finished with our big fish, then comes along an orca. An orca spots a school of big fish. It's going to want to have a feed. So think about it as you've now graduated high school and you're considering going to university or TAFE or any other educational institution. As a result, you are considering tertiary education, and we can say this orca here is our tertiary consumer because it is the third organism to come along and consume all of these, consume our big fish here. Moving on to question 4. The arrows in a food chain represent the transfer of energy from one type of organism to another. Now, we talked about this earlier. The arrow shows how energy is transferred from, let's say, the seaweed to the small fish, or from the small fish to the secondary consumer, or the secondary consumer to the orca. So in this case, we could actually go ahead and say that that is true. Question 5. Which statements about the food chain above is true? So the first one here. The small fish are consumers of the seaweed. So the small fish are consumers of the seaweed. We can see that the arrow is pointing from the seaweed to the small fish. So let's go ahead and tick that one. The orcas consume seaweed, the orcas consume seaweed, small fish, and big fish. Well, based off this food chain, we can see that there is only a connection between the big fish and the orca. We can't actually see a direct link between the seaweed and the orca, or the small fish and the orca. So let's leave that one out there for now. The next one. The small fish are predators of the big fish. So the keyword here is predator. Now, if something is a predator, it means it hunts another organism. So what it's saying here is the small fish hunt the big fish. If we look at this food chain up here, can we see if that is true or false? The small fish hunt the big fish. Well, from what I can see here, it looks more like the big fish hunt the small fish. So the big fish are the predators in this case, not the small fish. So let's go ahead and leave that one blank. And lastly, the small fish are prey of the big fish. So if something is a prey of another organism, it is a food source. So in this case, it's saying the small fish are hunted by the big fish. Small fish, big fish. Big fish consumes small fish. So yes, we can go ahead and say that the small fish are prey of the big fish. So if we go ahead and check the answers, it does match what we've been discussing. Question 6. In the food chain that was above just here, the orca can be classified as the apex predator. So for those who need a refresher, an apex predator is the top of the food chain. So in that ecosystem, nothing else can come by and hunt it. So in this case, nothing else comes to actually consume our orca. So we can go ahead and say the orca is the apex predator in that food chain. Question 7. Why are the producers important in a food chain, and where do they get their energy from? So we've got a producer here. Think about it. If we didn't have this seaweed, what is this small fish going to feed on? So, without the seaweed, a lot of small fish will most likely die off because there isn't enough food for all the fish. As a result, there's going to be less small fish around for these big fish to hunt. So these populations might die off a little bit or get a bit smaller as well, which would also affect the food source for the orca. Because if there's less big fish, it means you have more orcas hunting less big fish. So it's like a little bit of a knock-on effect. Without the seaweed, or if there's less of the seaweed, we have less small fish, which means we have less big fish, and ultimately it could affect our populations of orca. So what we're looking for here is producers are important because they convert energy from the sun into usable energy that can sustain life. Instead of eating other organisms, producers create food using energy from the sunlight. This process is called photosynthesis. Plants and algae are examples of organisms that can photosynthesize. Now for question 8. A student has drawn this food web on the organisms living near a coral reef. Identify 3 mistakes in this diagram. Remember, zooplankton are animals that float in the sea. In the diagram, the microscopic zooplankton are shown much larger than their actual size. So, what they're just saying is the zooplankton shown here is magnified, so it's not to scale. Okay, so based off the information we can see in this food web, true or false? The apex predator should not be at the top of the food web. Well, it can be, so long as we can see that there is no other organisms consuming that predator. We can call it the apex predator. The producers should be at the bottom of the food web. Producers at the bottom. The arrow between the clownfish and the reef shark should point towards the reef shark. So, clownfish, reef shark. What this arrow tells us is the energy is being consumed from the clownfish is obtaining its energy from the reef shark, which is why the arrow is pointing to this clownfish. What that also tells us is that clownfish eat reef sharks? ? So personally, I have never seen a clownfish eat a reef shark, so I would actually classify that as a mistake. There should always be a direct arrow from the producer to the apex predator. And lastly, the arrow between the crab and the algae, so the crab and the algae, should point towards the crab. So once again, this arrow here tells us that the algae is consuming the crab, when in actual fact it's the crab that consumes the algae. So, I'm going to go ahead and click this one. And lastly, we'll go ahead and select the producers being at the bottom. So, if we go ahead and show our answers, it correlates that producers are always at the bottom of a food web. The arrows between the clownfish and the reef shark should be swapped, and also between the algae and the crab. So, moving on to question 9. After thinking about it, the student redraws the food web shown on this right-hand side. Why is this a good food web? List 3 reasons you can think of. So, this new food web is a lot better because it shows and it follows the rules of drawing clear food webs. Specifically, it shows our producer is down the very bottom, apex predators up the top. It shows clear levels for our producers. So producers on one level, primary consumers on one level, secondary consumers on another level, and our tertiary, or in this case apex predators, on another level. It also has arrows showing the energy flowing up the food web. So energy goes from the algae to the crab, to the blue tang, to the reef shark, or the algae to the clownfish, to the reef shark, or even from the algae to the zooplankton, to the fish, to the reef shark. And lastly, the arrows always point away from one organism to the other that eats it. So for example, from the primary consumer, for example, the zooplankton, to the secondary consumer, in this case the clownfish, or from the crab to the blue tang. Question 10. Identify 2 food chains in the new food web above. So what we know about food chains is it's a single direct flow of energy. So This one here says it goes from algae to zooplankton to crab to reef shark. So can we see that link? So algae to zooplankton to crab to reef shark. So I can't see the link between the zooplankton and the crab. So this one is, I'm going to say, we leave that. The next option is from algae to zooplankton to clownfish to reef shark. So algae to zooplankton to clownfish to reef shark. Yes, so we can see that link there. Let's now take a look at the next one. Algae to blue tang to reef shark. Algae to blue tang to reef shark. Well, that's also correct. And lastly, algae to the crab to clownfish to reef shark. Algae to crab to clownfish to reef shark. So once again, we cannot see the link between the crab and the clownfish. So that there is not a food chain. So we'll go ahead and show the answer, which is these two options, B and C. Question 11. In the new food web, so this one above here, the clownfish is both a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. So if it's a primary consumer, it means it sources its food directly from the producer. So as a primary consumer, yes, we can see it directly eats algae. And next up, as a secondary consumer. So it tells us that it consumes an organism that consumes the producer. In this case, it consumes the zooplankton that has fed on the algae. So both primary and secondary consumer are correct in classifying this clownfish. So we'll go ahead and click true. Okay, for number 12, construct a food chain using at least 3 organisms and the arrow tool. So we're trying to show these relationships. So what we could have seen here, okay, so here we've got one food chain that shows at least 3 organisms. So we've gone from the grass to the beetle to the mouse to the hawk. So this is absolutely correct. And it tells us a story. Your grass is your producer. Your beetles feed off the grass. Your mice come along and feed off the beetles. And your hawks come along and feed on the mice. So that is a perfectly correct example of a food chain. Number 13. What do you think an ecosystem is? Note, if you're not sure, don't worry too much. As an introduction to this unit, it's not expected that you know the answer yet. At the moment, just record what you think an ecosystem is. So some student responses in this case. Someone's come along and thought, an ecosystem is a biological systems connecting animals in a single habitat or environment. And that seems to be all the responses for now, but that's okay. So for now, have a think about it. There's no right or wrong because it is a question that we haven't discussed yet. And lastly here, how do ecosystems relate food chains and food webs? So once again, we haven't actually explored it, so it's okay to just take a guess. So one student here has considered that they relate to these things as they show how animals in a single habitat connect with one another, which often is with being an animal's prey or an animal being a predator to an animal in their habitat. So what this person here is trying to say is that you've got these relationships between organisms, and it's shown in these food chains and food webs. So, once again, if you haven't already, go back to your activity sheet, go through, check your answers, check that they make sense and they match with what we've just talked about. And down the bottom, please click on the blue button that says, "I'm finished, show my teacher."